former advisor to Keir Starmer says that the Labour Party rebellion over changes to disability benefits isn't so much a failure of leadership from number 10 Downing Street, it's an incredibly sophisticated operation by the rebels. Is he right? You decide when you listen to this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio. This big Labour rebellion over the government's plans to change disability benefits is gathering strength. Since we recorded the last episode of Newscast, 6 new Labour backbenchers have added their name to this amendment, which, if it went through on Tuesday, would basically kill the whole legislation that would implement these changes to personal independence payments and the health-related top-up to universal credit. The other big thing that's changed is the tone from the centre of government. Gone are the days of, well, yesterday, when Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, was really digging his heels in and saying he was going to carry on. Now he's really signalling that he's in listening mode. And it's very clear that the government and the backbenchers are in negotiations about where they could compromise. A compromise that was not really being offered 24, 48 hours ago. So what is going on here, and what does this reveal about how the Labour government works and the Labour Party works, and actually how politics works these days? Somebody who knows a lot better than most is coming back to Newscast today. It is Luke Sullivan, who is currently a public affairs director at the communications and consultancy firm Headland. But before that, he was a senior advisor to Keir Starmer. And before that, he worked for the Labour chief whip. In other words, the person whose job it is to get all the backbenchers to vote for the government's programme. And yes, Luke has come back to Newscast.
Thank you.
Obviously went well the last time. You've decided to come back. So, as somebody who has experienced working with Keir Starmer, but also crucially working with the Labour chief whip, so the person who has to get these votes through and maintain the parliamentary party, what is your theory about what has gone so wrong here from the point of view of number 10 Downing Street?
Well, I think first and foremost, nothing yet has happened in terms of they haven't lost a vote. They're clearly working really hard between now and Tuesday to try and reach a resolution. I think in terms of what happened on Monday, I mean, I think it's really worth just sort of saying this was the most incredible, definitely in my time in Westminster, sort of a parliamentary, shenanigans operation from the rebels. I mean, there's one sort of old hand referred to me as this was almost like a sort of secret Al-Qaeda plot with cells within cells. Right. To the point where I think,
because you couldn't have got that many people that quickly without some serious organisation.
Yeah, and they have sprung a very effective political trap. They have done those things that are always so difficult when you're trying to manage rebellions. How do you keep everyone together? How do you get people to put their stake in the ground? And it sounds very technical and, parliamentary, and I know people's eyes will glaze over. But,
I'm not here.
The fact of getting 80 odd people in with almost relative no knowledge that they were going to do this, it is a incredible feat from them.
I mean, wouldn't that be the sort of thing that the chief whip and the other whips would get wind of? Like they chat to, like they call them their flock. They chat to them all the time, don't they?
I mean, I think there's two different things here. It's clear the whips knew the scale of unease at these reforms. And, some people ask, are you surprised at the number? And my answer to that is 120 plus. I think there's been some very good journalism, and there was a number of about 170 that was out. I think the Times reported at the time sort of getting together the different numbers of letters that were on, different letters flying around or that had been sent across. So I think the scale of it isn't really a surprise given what we knew. I think what has clearly taken everybody by surprise is that these people had found a sort of quite an interesting parliamentary technique to essentially force the government to really confront a potential losing a vote, and ultimately they're now in negotiations about concessions.
Yeah, because this is this idea that it's a reasoned amendment, which means when you're doing the second reading of the bill, which is what was going to happen on Tuesday or is happening on Tuesday, the reasoned amendment is the way that you just destroy the bill and prevent it going to any of its future stages. Yeah. It's like it's a poison pill.
Yeah, and I mean it's I think these parliamentary shenanigans, it sort of takes us back to Brexit cast.
Yeah, where Keir Starmer was like the prime author of a lot of these things.
I mean, everyone was here thinking with a massive majority, political journalism and politics was going to be sort of boring and dull. I mean, I think it's clear that Westminster continues to create news.
So let's hear that clip of the Prime Minister, and it starts off with him referring to the people that he's trying to help with these reforms.
At the moment, they are failed every single day by the broken system created by the Conservatives, which achieves neither. Yeah. I know colleagues across the House are eager to start fixing that, and so am I, and that all colleagues want to get this right, and so do I. We want to see reform implemented with Labour values of fairness. That conversation will continue in the coming days so we can begin making change together on Tuesday.
Right, a few things we could look at there, individual words. Actually, but first of all, let's talk about the tone, because actually, if you compare that with what he was saying at the NATO summit the day before, where he was kind of saying, no surrender, these are people this is just noises off, which annoyed a lot of the backbenchers. What do you think changed overnight for him to now say this?
I mean, I think what's really clear, and we saw it about this time last night when I think Luke Pollard went out and did the sort of evening round led by Angela.
Minister.
There was a much more, sort of putting oil on troubled waters approach, much calmer, trying to sort of understand that, ultimately Labour politicians, welfare is an issue that they really, really care passionately about. It's something that I think when I was on the show last time, I talked about, welfare being that issue about why people go into public service and how they view their role in being an MP. This was always going to be a really difficult vote. I thought, that was absolutely the right tone from the Prime Minister there.
Eventually.
And ultimately he, I think often in politics it's about, as long as you get to a position where you recognise where concerns are, he's trying to, he's clearly in a process with, the rebels to try and reach a landing zone on concessions. They're clearly working very hard. We've had some briefing in the last few hours from some of those, who are currently in the rebel camp who are saying, those conversations going well, that, they are making
tone progress. Is quite different today.
The tone is really, and it's really important. I think, especially when you're talking about rebellions, but you're also talking about these issues, just to try and take some of the heat out of it.
Well, then let's look at that word he said in that answer there about fairness. And what does that reveal when he says Labour values of fairness will be the solution to this? What does that suggest in terms of a compromise?
I mean, I think we've seen some, we've obviously seen some briefing from the rebels about where they're, essentially what they're seeking to achieve. One area is on PIP and the others on universal credit. But I think, one of the striking things, and I think it's one of the interesting tactics that those who tabled the Reason Amendment, it wasn't attacking the government for the motives. It was accepting that there needed to be reform, that it wasn't fair, that, we've got a huge ballooning welfare bill. It's completely unsustainable as it goes, but that in any reform, it's got to balance, ensuring that there is a social security, lock for people who need it, to support them, but also that essentially, people who are working hard, also have fairness as taxpayers. And I think, it was obviously a message to the public in terms of in Parliament, but I think, the point you're probably getting at is it was a message clearly to the Labour Party. And it's one of those words when Labour leaders, Labour politicians talk about fairness, it's a sort of go-to word.
What will Keir Starmer be doing to convince people? You must have seen him in situations where he's had to hit the phones and talk round recalcitrant colleagues. Like, how does he do it?
I mean, in any sort of relationship, it's trying to explain your position, try and bring them round to why you're doing what you're doing.
Is he a persuasive kind of guy in those situations?
He can be an extraordinarily persuasive person. He's very logical. He'll be explaining, why he thinks this package is the right one. I think part of the problem the government have, and it comes to the sort of the blunt nature of the legislation, which is this is actually quite a small parliamentary bill. It's only about 21 pages. So about 6 clauses. It's quite small. It's quite limited. But on the whole, it's the things that people find quite difficult to vote through. it doesn't have, and I think this is probably where Number 10 feel probably quite reasonably frustrated. They've announced a sort of huge package of, whether it be the Warm Homes Fund, whether it be about things about trying to get people back into work. There's a whole host of sort of nice things that the government's doing in its reform agenda, but because of the way they've decided to do this in a quite limited way, other measures don't necessarily need legislation. MPs are actually, on the whole, voting on some of the really difficult stuff. And that obviously makes it harder to sort of swallow and explain why you're doing what you're doing in a sort of compelling, clear way.
Oh, you mean so backbench MPs, when people look at their record, all they'll end up seeing is, oh, you voted for the cuts to the disability benefits, but they don't see them being in favour of stuff that didn't need to be voted on at all.
Yeah.
Do you think Keir Starmer has maybe been a little bit too distant from the Labour Parliamentary Party? Because that's one of the accusations that's been flying around this week.
Yeah, and
Yes, he has.
No, we talked about this last time about, the time and demands on the Prime Minister. I think it's obvious that
It's true, it happens to every Prime Minister.
It happens to every Prime Minister. He clearly, the demands on his time, and I remember, when I was Keir's political director and we went through bad times or tough times, and it doesn't matter when things are going well whether or not people see the boss because they're happy, and when things are tougher and they don't, it's quite an easy thing to grasp for.
So wouldn't a smart operator then be seeing the bump in the road that's coming up and then going and working the room to get the support?
And I think what you have seen, and my understanding over the past few months is, the government does realise they need to get people out a lot more. Key members of staff, key members of the cabinet. I think there was obviously a lot of talk about cabinet members ringing around, cabinet members and senior staff being sort of in the terraces, the bars, the hallways, trying to speak to MPs. It's difficult, and the sort of demands on the Prime Minister are always going to be, you could fill his diary or her diary, many times over a day. It's about the impactful moments, about how do you build that connection with a political leader.
I suppose the difference is, though, what if Keir Starmer's version of an impactful conversation is different from a Tory backbencher's version? They might just want to see him or be asked their opinion from time to time, and Keir Starmer doesn't think that's impactful, so he doesn't do it.
No, I mean he does see the value. He does see the value in his colleagues and tries to work hard. I know he tries to be as contactable as possible in terms of his interactions with colleagues, but. I think the other part of this, and in a way, it's sort of been borne out this week in where the Prime Minister has been. Is he's not unreasonably spent a lot of time at NATO this week. And that's massively important in terms of what's going on in terms of global security. The national security of the country. That inevitably means he's not here at a time of political turbulence, and when if he was here and able to talk to colleagues, it might make things a lot easier and smoother.
I almost feel there's no point asking the next question because I kind of know what you'll say already, but will Keir Starmer think that some heads have to roll as a result of this? Like, would he be considering whether to, I don't know, fire the chief whip, Sir Alan Campbell, because this is a massive dropped ball when it comes to party management, or maybe fire another advisor because a few names are being mentioned as being responsible for this in Number 10?
Yeah, I mean,
but I just know what you'll say. That's not the kind of thing he does.
No, I was going to say, to declare an interest as, sort of man and boy raised in the whip's office, and I could never think of a better person, to be the government chief whip than Alan Campbell at a time like this. If things are difficult, the person who's prepared to tell me the difficult things when I might not necessarily want to hear them. I don't think it's a
but he missed this massive plot.
I don't know, and I don't think that's right. I think it was obvious. It was. It's been clear for some time the scale of concern, and they've carried on because they believe this to be the right package. I think there were other ways they could have solved this, and I think the whips have been very clear about where they believed, and I think probably proven right to be. However, I think where do you get to with Keir? I think one of his real great strengths is he doesn't really do recriminations and looking back. He is much more a sort of person when something goes wrong, he backs the people and let's fix it. Let's fix it. Let's fix what's gone wrong. Let's make sure we get to a place where we can get through this. And I think ultimately that's what he's decided to do this week. And I think, as the clip you showed earlier, he's clearly aware of the problems. He will be speaking to key people over the next coming days. And as he said, like, they are determined to get this reform package through, to bring, people with them. And, I think, even when he does achieve that, he's not going to unite the Labour Party on this issue. There are going to be some people who still don't. But, he has the convictions to carry on.
Do you think it's true, because it sort of uses a truism in politics, that once people get a taste for rebellion, they rebel more? Do you think that is true?
Well, I mean, you sort of get into sort of, breaking the seal, don't you? I hear why it's always said. I'm not sure it's true. I think, obviously once you've done something that's quite difficult, things sometimes are easier to do the second time. But I think ultimately, nobody has rebelled yet in terms of that list. There hasn't been the vote. I think, it's clear from both the rebels and the government a desire to get a package that can have as maximum support as possible. Whether people will try this tactic again on other bills, I suspect it's very,
Yes.
They will, but I suspect, it will be very, very difficult to pull it off because, ultimately this is an issue that sort of goes, it sort of transcends their sort of loyalty to the government and the voting for what the government says.
It's as much an issue of conscience as voting
for Labour MPs,
unassisted dying or the abortion.
For Labour MPs,
criminalisation
it
of
is
abortion.
absolutely.
Yeah. And I think one of the real good things about chatting to you guys who are practitioners or ex-practitioners of it is, I was thinking back to the very, very beginning of this conversation, and like we in the media, and I think a lot of the public watching this will think, oh, there's a chance the government might lose this vote. You don't even entertain that possibility. You're like, no, there's no way the vote will happen if there's going to be a loss. It's all about what's the next stage, what can be done to avoid it. That's the way you approach the problem. It's not, oh, we might lose here.
Yeah,
that's not how politics works.
It's 3D chess, and you're trying to you're trying to make decisions in real time, trying to think ahead as to what's going to happen. And it's been a very, very interesting thing to watch. I think one of the things, it probably has been too interesting, for everybody involved. And I think, to a point now where, the government and the rebels need some space to have that conversation. Obviously, journalists doing your job aren't going to give them that. And, everything's amplified. You've got some very, very tired people. It's hot. And frankly, it's Westminster summer party season, and there's
hangovers playing a role here.
These are alcohol, lack of sleep. A lot of people being around. People being very excited. Like, these are not good conditions.
Oh, it worries me that that's such an important factor in how the country's run.
And also, you've forgotten the other key rule in sort of British politics, which is mad politics always happens during Glastonbury week. Often with a number of the politicians still at Glastonbury.
Yeah, true. So, let's hope they all make it back in time for Tuesday. Brilliant. Thank you very much for coming in, Luke. Oh, actually, before you go, I'm about to play the interview with Sarah Vine. Recorded yesterday, because she's got her new book out, which is all about her marriage to Michael Gove and just what politics does to a relationship. I won't ask about your own relationships. That's not what you're here for. But one of the interesting things about that book is you realise all the stuff about the Cameron era being a chumocracy.
Yeah.
It's true. They were all mates. They were all round at each other's houses all the time, going to each other's parties, going on holiday with each other. But then you think, well, hang on, actually, it looks like lots of administrations are like that. You look at Labour and like how many people have like sisters who are also in the cabinet, or who are married to people who are ministers who were married to people in Number 10. Actually, there's a big chumocracy in Labour as well, because it's a big family.
Yeah, the Labour Party, I think, as all parties, are big, weird, dysfunctional families, and the relationships go back very long time. And I think, as with any sort of intense work environment, it's pretty obvious that you're going to get drawn to the sort of same types of people who are interested in what you're doing. I think,
But now that you're not so in it day to day, do you look back and think, oh, it was a bit weirdly, not incestuous, because that's a terrible word, but like it was all a bit, everyone was all a bit too cooped up and all a bit too married?
I think, I mean, I was really, I was lucky that my lovely wife and 3 children. My wife is
Hello to them who are listening.
Is political in a sense of she cares about politics, but she's not Labour. She's not that interested in politics. She always had a test of, what was big in politics was if it had made BBC One radio news or it was on her Instagram feed. And she didn't live and breathe it like me. I think for me, for somebody who's a political obsessive, I'm sure like you is a political obsessive, that sort of somebody else who's not so bothered about it helps. I think the thing that's useful to know is just being aware of those relationships and sometimes realising where the awkwardnesses might be or where the deep friendships are. And I think that's the same in any political party, but it's especially right in the Labour Party.
And so, yes, here is my conversation with Sarah Vine, who until recently was married to Michael Gove. She's got her new book out. It's called How Not to Be a Political Wife. It is an eye-opening read about how politics affects a marriage. And also, it opens by talking about the day the Leave campaign won the Brexit referendum, which was 9 years ago this week. So actually, it's quite a good time to have yet another conversation that's quite revealing about how politics in Britain works these days. Sarah, hello.
Hello.
Well, thank you for giving me an entertaining read the last few days. I mean, you put it all out there.
I have, yes.
Why did you want to write this book?
I think because I needed to make sense of it. I mean, I'm a writer, so that's what I do. That's how I make sense of the world. I have to put it down on a piece of paper, otherwise it just swirls around my head.
Oh, so you didn't really know what you were going to write when you started?
It's quite. I think. I mean, someone said to me it's quite stream of consciousness, and I think it probably is. It is. I am slightly spilling my guts onto the page. I just felt so. I wanted to get it in a manageable format, which for me is a book. Then it's just all in one place. And then because I sort of wanted to draw a line under it all in my life. It's the last 10, well, it's not 10 years, it's 9 years, but it will be 10 years next year. So in my head, it's a decade since Brexit has been quite...
This week, 9 years this week.
9 years this week has been quite sort of life-changing for me. So I needed to sort of get it all in one place. And I think I was ready. I mean, for ages, I wasn't ready to do it. I couldn't have done it. I probably couldn't have done it 2 years ago. I couldn't have done it 3 years ago. I felt I should do it now. I think post-divorce as well, it was a sort of cathartic moment. And it was also because while I was still married to Michael Gove, it was impossible to do it because it would have exposed him in a way that would have made everyone hysterical. Whereas now they're just all angry with me, but he's not involved. Do you know what I mean?
Okay, so you've been quite generous.
Well, I just didn't want to sort of because while he was still in frontline politics, I couldn't really do this. You can write books. Obviously, I could have written a book, but it wouldn't have been honest. It wouldn't have been straightforward. It wouldn't have been as visceral as this one is.
Well, let's bring a few bits of that to life then. I was really struck by when you talk about the expenses scandal, which was that series of stories in The Telegraph in about 2009, where they got the leaked expenses data from the House of Commons. And you basically say that was the point that Michael Gove, the love of your life, he kind of changed as a person. Just explain to people the change that you noticed.
Well, it was, and
maybe actually it was a change in retrospect, actually, not necessarily at the time.
No, I think at the time it felt really cataclysmic. I mean, it was because it was such a punishment beating for so many MPs. I mean, I don't think he's unique in this. I think it changed a lot of people who were MPs. It was a real shock to the system, and it was so vicious. And a lot of it was... a lot of it turned out not to be true or not to be correct, and they hadn't made the mistakes. But it was a lynch mob basically, and it was the first time that Michael had, I think, that both of us had our kind of personas twisted out of shape by politics and by the agenda that was underlying that whole sort of saga. And for him, it was very traumatic because, he wasn't eventually exonerated. He hadn't made any mistakes. He'd done exactly what he was supposed to do or what he was entitled to do. But I think it really made him question himself. And I think went really to his core, which is that he always felt that he was, whatever else, he was very straightforward, honest. He is one of those people who is kind of in a Presbyterian Scottish way. He's very straight. He's very correct about things. And I think it really undermined his sense of self. And I think it also, I think it upset his parents enormously, and he really found that very hard as well, because his parents, quite important to him.
And then you have a few years where he's very high profile at various cabinet jobs, and he sort of becomes the politician, not that people love to hate, but kind of people love to fixate upon.
Yes, Michael Gove derangement syndrome. Yes, it's funny.
How did that sort of actually manifest itself in your life?
Well, he polarised opinion. I mean, there were lots of people who thought that he was brilliant at his education reforms and stuff, and there were also lots of people who were just raging against him. And it's very difficult. It's that thing of having of someone that you know very well, that you're married to, in fact, and just seeing how their whole image can be totally twisted out of shape by all these filters that people apply to them the whole time. Do you know what I mean? So if they're being portrayed in this publication or that publication, the actual person themselves becomes completely distorted, and it's very difficult for you to remain centered when that is happening to you. And it happened first to him, and then gradually it started happening to me, and then gradually it started happening to the children. And then that was when I sort of thought, no, this is just madness. I can't deal with this at all.
And you talk about the grief they get at school.
And unless you have a sort of really strong protective structure around you, it does eventually start to get to you. It's a resilience thing. It's like, I don't know, if you're a boxer and you're in the ring, you can take the first few punches, but then when you're on your sort of fifth round and you've been punched 100 times, it really does start to hurt.
And then we come to Brexit. I'm not sure when you realised he was going to come out for Brexit.
Well, I think it was one of those things that I probably already. I sometimes when this book is really a lot about my mistakes too. But when I'm not comfortable with something, or I know that it's not going to be the way I want it to be, I have a tendency to bury my head in the sand. I think people often do, when they're facing something that's not, that they know it's going to be a nightmare. I think I realised probably sort of August 2015 that he was not. He was doing a lot of avoidance of talking about it as well, and I think that's when I realised that was the sign,
because the referendum was becoming inevitable then, because the Tories had won the majority in 2015 that summer, and then that meant we were on the road to the referendum.
Right, so there was a sort of sense that it was definitely going to happen, and I remember trying to have conversations with him and him going, and then just not really wanting to engage.
Because I think, is it in December, January, that Christmas, you're at Chequers with David Cameron, sat on the big squishy sofa, and he says to you,
and we had
is Michael going to run the Leave campaign?
And I'm like, yes, I think, I don't know. He said, is it going to be okay, basically? And I went, I think so. But then I was thinking, I said to Michael, actually, you really need to sit down with Dave and have a very honest conversation about this. And I just don't think that ever really happened.
Well, he said on that podcast with George Osborne and Ed Balls that moral cowardice? He hadn't quite been straight with kind of anybody, really.
No,
he found himself being drawn more and more into the campaign.
And I kept saying to him, you need to sit down and have a proper conversation. You just need to be honest and just say what you're thinking. And it just was, he just couldn't, I don't know, he couldn't for whatever reason. And he could, and he didn't really have it's funny because when I was sort of writing the book, I was sort of checking a few, I was checking with a few people, have I remembered this right? Is this, and one friend says to me, no, Sarah, I remember we came round to your house a lot, and you were really trying to get him to think again, and he just wasn't going to do it. So.
And then I don't want to re-traumatize you because it sounds like it was awful for you, but the night at the birthday party where you and Sam Cam, I don't say you and her have a row. She just has a massive go at you.
But that's fine, because by that stage I think she was so kind of at her wit's end. People have made a lot of that because it's the sort of psychodrama, isn't it? It's the kind of EastEnders moment. But actually, I say in the book, I don't really blame her, quite honestly. I mean, but by that point, everybody was just basically hysterical the whole time, and the friendship group had completely collapsed. Dave,
the friendship group, which was a huge part of your life.
Yeah, and we just, it was the two sides were just completely, and she was just very upset because I think don't let's forget, she had a much tougher time because she was actually in number 10. She was Prime Minister's wife, which is not an easy thing to be. And, she was I think she was getting it too. And I think, the stress was rubbing off on her as much as it was rubbing off on me.
And then we get to the famous week 9 years ago this week, and Vote Leave wins. But it sounds absolutely horrendous for you that morning.
I know,
it sounds awful.
It was like, I don't know, it's funny. It's the weirdest thing, because you think that everybody would be jubilant and excited, but in fact, it wasn't that way at all. It was like, I don't know, because it was just such a shock. And immediately it started to go wrong. I mean, it wasn't really, it was a matter of hours, wasn't it, before everything started to crumble. And that sense of, and, the moment when Dave walked away, and I just realised that was it. Everything was going to go to absolute, rot, because without him there, everything just started to collapse, because, and that's what that, I mean, I don't criticize Dave as a human very much in the book. If you've read it, you'll know that I'm not kind of, but I think that moment was a big mistake, because I think if he had stayed and just sort of steadied the ship, I think things might have gone.
He would say that would have been politically impossible, though.
Why, though? Who says that it's impossible?
Well, I mean, think about all those Brexiteers who kind of forced the referendum on him in the first place. Like, what would they have done to him in that interview?
Well, they couldn't.
He couldn't have run the country.
Well, but he could have at least. No, he could have run the country, and he could have at least.
As a sort of caretaker.
Yeah, of course he was going to go after that, of course. But I think he'd had enough anyway, generally speaking. So I think, there was that interview that he did. I can't remember who, one of your guys, where he sort of basically intimated that he wasn't going to stay for much.
Oh, James Landale in the kitchen. Yeah, when he said, it's like shredded wheat. 2 is enough, 3 terms is too many.
Exactly. So I think he was already sort of, shuffling towards the exit.
And then there's the saddest bit of the entire book, which is the moment you realise your marriage is over, which is the day you move house.
Yes. Sadly, yes. I
mean, it's horrible, that bit. Because you actually have it. You can pinpoint the moment where you're like, oh yeah, this is just going to work.
Yeah, this is not going. Yeah, this has gone slightly wrong. Yeah, it's funny. I think perhaps anyone else who's been through a kind of breakup like that, it's not the big kind of moment. It's not the big show moment that makes you realise it. It's the little detail, isn't it? It's the tiny little organic moments that don't quite work. And it was just that we'd moved house, and all of these, Michael has an enormous collection of books. I mean, gigantic. And they were all in boxes. And we were moving house, and he just didn't engage at all. I mean, he didn't even, he just went and sat and read a book while my mother and I and the removal men tried to sort of get this out. It was just like he wasn't participating in the home life at all.
Yeah, and that's what I mean when I said a few minutes ago about I think I almost learnt more about marriage than I did about politics reading this, which I was quite surprised by.
I think it's very important to be. I think what I've learned, and again, I didn't realise this when I got married, because I think most people don't. But I've learned that you have to be on the same page and you have to want the same thing. And I think it was then that I started to realise that Michael didn't want the same stuff as me anymore, that he wanted something else, and that our paths had sort of diverged. And I think the thing is, we both reacted very differently to the sort of trauma of Brexit, not just the result, but the kind of fallout. And I wanted to run away and go very quickly in the other direction as far as possible, and he wanted to go back in and fix it. And so there were two very opposing paths.
Not to sound too grand, but do you think like the whole country went through something a bit similar with Brexit?
Well, in different, I'm sure in different ways, yes, because it was a sort of divorce. It was a schism, wasn't it? It was the whole thing is a sort of, it's a psychodrama. I mean, it's not just a political decision. It's a really emotional, personal decision about our relationship with Europe, with our closest neighbours and all of that. And I do think that, the personal can sometimes be the universal, and you have to sort of, that's one of the other reasons I wrote the book. I just wanted to sort of put that notion into words a little bit, that I looked around me and I just saw lots of people for different reasons and in different ways having similar responses. and then from my own family and all.
Because your family all live in European countries,
yes,
don't they?
Yes, none of them.
Spain, Italy,
exactly. So they're all on the continent, really, and
and pretty angry with you.
Furious. Well, not so much anymore, but at the time, really upset and not. I understand that feeling that Remainers had, and that Europeans had of feeling really rejected. I kind of understood. I did understand that because they felt the same.
I'm just thinking back to some of the things you said in this conversation. Like, for example, you talked about in the expenses scandal there being a lynch mob. I mean, you're a newspaper columnist. I mean, you've been in some lynch mobs.
Yeah, although I'm not. If you look at my stuff, I'm not that lynch mobby. In fact, it's probably my one failing as a newspaper columnist that I don't tend to jump on bandwagons too often.
Well, I was just looking back to your column about Ed Miliband's two kitchens, and you said that his wife were like aliens.
Well, yes, but that's not a lynch mob. That's just that was me writing what I thought was quite an entertaining column. But it's obvious that when they were photographed in that kitchen, that wasn't their real kitchen, okay? It was obvious to anyone who was looking at it. And the idea of trying to make that into your real kitchen when it's obviously your utility kitchen, I thought was quite laughable, and it made me laugh. And I wrote a piece because that's what you do.
Okay, here's another way of looking at it. Like, there's a bit in the book where you talk about, and it's when the Mail on Sunday is going to write this story about Michael Gove took cocaine when he was in his 20s, and one of your, well, I won't say colleagues because they're your sister paper, so somebody who works basically in the same stable as you calls you up, and you sort of inadvertently get involved in confirming the story, even though you don't really say anything. I mean, did you not think, and you were really angry about that whole way of working, but did you never think, I'm part of that because I write a column for their sister paper, and even though it's a different bit of the paper, it's still the same.
Yeah, well, I suppose in that way, yeah, of course. I mean, of course, I was upset about that because it was very personal to me because of course I work for that newspaper, and I've done a lot of so it was hurtful. And also because it was sort of a little bit kind of weird and done in a slightly lateral way. But, that's the whole point about the book. It's messy. This is why this.
You can say that again.
It's not. I'm not trying to really make my case particularly, or I'm not trying to justify who I am or what I do. I'm just trying to say this is what it's like. This is the world. This is the world that we live in, and these are the lessons that you learn. And yes, maybe I wrote a slightly rude piece about Ed Miliband's kitchen, but does that mean that someone who Stuart Lee, who's a comedian, has to compare having sex with me to a dead pig, which is what he did? So yeah, I mean, it's not. I agree. Yes, maybe I shouldn't have said those things, or shouldn't have tried to make those jokes. Maybe they were crass. Maybe they were not fair. But they certainly weren't as bad as a lot of the things that have been written and said about me subsequently. And when you talk about the cocaine story, I felt very bad for Michael because the circumstances of him, that story had not been stood up. It was only then confirmed because they tricked him into doing it. And I felt, well, okay, and it was 25 years ago or 30 years, it was before I even met him. And it was just, and it came on the back of some other stuff that was a bit, like running 2 consecutive front pages about him having an affair with Dominic Cummings.
Yeah.
Which would have been laughable and is laughable. And anyway, who cares? But the point is that it was upsetting for the kids, and I felt that I was responsible for not stopping and all of that kind of stuff. So that's why the book is messy, because all of that is in there.
Yeah, you're very, very, very honest about it all.
And no one is ever honest about any of this stuff. Everyone pretends that they're okay with it, or they pretend that they're invulnerable. I'm not invulnerable to any of this stuff, and this is the world that we're in. So I just wanted people to have an insight into that.
Well, it's been entertaining chatting to you today. Thank you very much.
Good.